presentation that I'm trying is something very new to myself. So there are no mistakes because I don't know what it is. The subject that came up to my mind when ARCASIA here and I called up is I said, what is the significance that's really, really affecting human beings today? It is the urbanization factor. But then the sense of joy of that achievement is also there. We all know that within the next 20 years, 70% of the humans will be living in urban spaces. I will not take too much time. I'm trying a presentation system from what I call it the silent crucible, which represents the city. If my handwriting is bad, it's as bad as my one. That's okay. Now, what happens after that is a fascination if you assume the city urban center. But then what happens to the city? A city is bound by boundaries, imaginary or physical. In the past, they did make factors and said, this will be the boundary of the cities, people will rule. Then an empty crucible, an empty city is absolutely no use. You can build 4 walls, 6 walls, nothing happens. You need activity. Because the human beings need activity. I'm going to jump a lot of points. Then what happens with the human activity is a sense of all the, what I'll call the elements interacting with the senses. When this interaction happens, the human being achieves something else. He becomes in, but it cannot happen to an individual person. Now, if I start putting the elements inside this crucible of very fragrant nature, the 5 elements I'm putting, if I push it, what happens? Nothing happens. It's still silent. You may build the infrastructure, but building the infrastructure makes no sense because you need something to happen. So when there's something to happen, you need energy. So what happens is you need energy, which is fire or whatever it is. But when you create fire, you also create ash. But then, watch this point at this point. If this fire happens, which energy happens, and the infrastructure is there, and if there is nothing else, the whole crucible will crumble. It will melt. Now, that is dangerous. So you need what is called as communication. That communication happens when you put the liquid. I call it liquid here. It could be gas. It could be any of these elements, but they go in between. When they go in between, communication happens. When communication happens, the human being comes alive, and the activity happens. It can be entertainment. It can be sports. It can be business, it can be art, it is a culture. This starts coming in. Then something happens at this point. But then what happens, the moment this happens, there's a tremendous sense of attraction, which is called heavy urbanization or a castical movement of people from outside to the inside. This is when the danger happens. The density starts increasing. If the density starts increasing, what happens to the space? The communication which you made is suffocated. How do you release it? Can you release it? Or can you do something else with it? Or do you create secondary cities? Now, at this point, there is something else that happens. There is what you call the governance, the government, the politics, and others who come and say, let us put a lid on this. If you put a lid on this, they think they will not have any further expansion of this, but then something else of a phenomenal nature called pressure builds up. The very negative what you anticipated start putting the pressure, which could really burst open or even burst everywhere. That is more dangerous. That's what's happening to most cities, even like Jaipur. Bangalore has gone burst anyway. We just burst away. Now, instead of that bursting, can you have other elements of cities happening? How do you happen it? Do you open this up and happening? If you notice city centers that were happening in the past, we had a large artery like the human being, and the little nerves and the little fellows who distributed a little wet. That's the way life happened all over. Unfortunately, what happened, our urban planners and the city fathers started making these into big, big roads. They started breaking to make spaces happen. They thought business was making buildings. It is a very dangerous way of approach. You started like Bangalore or any city. We had parks, we had lungs, we had movements. Then we found we could walk. Today, we don't have parks, we don't have open spaces, we can't even walk because the traffic moves in and out. This traffic is the human ability to move from place to place. Without traffic, communication is arrested. How do you address these points? Do you build more cubicles outside? Do you digest this and happen? And what happens to this? The energy input. It can only sustain that much energy. Now, there is another thing that I want you to start looking at this point. If these elements were pushed in all activities of the human being, without the energy here, it would have been compacted. Now some cooking happens. When the cooking happens, there is a digestion that happens with the cooking. When that frequency starts working together, there is human life that starts coming into an eternal thing. Can we regenerate into smaller cubicles outside, which are called, some people call it satellite cities, some people call it movements, they call it what is transmigration and systems. This is a potential for a lot of possibilities. But at the same time, the culture of this place, can it be diversed, or something else that happens, can it be diversed? Or should the lid be taken off? If you take off the lid, the cooking stops. If you put on the lid, the pressure builds up. This is the conflict that any, what I call, acoustical problem of urbanization, or what you call as a high level of human interactivity happens. Activity must happen, but must not be killed. This is the problem that we face. How we will react to this place and how we will go up and down on this is the many time of activities. This is where sometimes I put across and say, the poor man out there, when he has his legs and parts up there on his face there, what happens to that human being? Can he become something of a transition from here, or the whole place transfigures into a megapolis? Can the thing become bigger and bigger? If it becomes bigger and bigger, the entire holdback of these places also becomes very difficult. I don't want to take, because this type of lecture can keep on going for a very long time. But I would like to only interact and react with you people to say, how is a simple human being, which is mankind, can interact with the elements, with the space, in time, at that particular special action, in that particular technology and whatever you might call it, to make life something sensitive, something usable, something which creates a past for the present to project a future. You can interpret it in many, many ways, but this is the ultimate truth. The reality must be faced and responded by what I would call the urban planners or the human citizen or the very governing systems. There is one sense that has been taken off deliberately into this factor. I took it off because that becomes, in time and space, a thing, what is called the finite thrust, or the release of chaos. But then, the Indian culture, or the culture of Asia, the chaos, there is one thing called the Western culture called order. In the Indian, or what I would call the Asian philosophy of thinking, the order lies in the chaos. Because it's in the chaos. If you can manage this within this, and then expand it and move it into further thing, the density, you will find somehow works. How the government works, without the government, is something that the future will respond to you. How much can the density take? How much can the fluidity take? How much can communication take? What sort of communication systems can happen? Depends on how many crucibles you can have and how much of energy you consume. Because I believe energy is infinite. I don't believe energy is limited. The question is the efficiency of using the energy is the issue involved. Because with the energy, the human life can, the moment you stop this, it has. The moment you take this off and simply put the energy inside, the whole thing will collapse. I start looking at these points in an extremely, what I would say, a sensitive way of looking at human life. I've been pausing this over all my presentations of really putting it about 100 things. When I say, use the word, if I put it out like this, as a burst, as a pressure, what would happen? The ashes happen. Then where do they head? Will the waste become wealth? I have no idea. You have to start working on the waste, which looks like the ash, the elements, and I believe something really, really is the power, because this is an energy part that goes into the human being. Where's he gone? The urban collapse is what they called it. I said I like the urban collapse. I like the urban movement of elements. But when it comes to full burst heat, something transitional happens for the human being. And this fellow will go back to become the hunter and the nomad. From transition happens another transition. Can you rise beyond this, take over many spaces, beyond Earth, beyond the seas, and create another space? I don't know. Because I can't project the future. I can only start looking at the future and saying, I look at the past, I look at the present, but looking at the past to the present is only a sense of interactive communication. But can the past know can the present or the past know the future? No way. Can the future know the present? No way. But somehow we need the communication to happen there and there and there. That is the human system. Life cycle must continue to happen. Death, birth, if it's a sense of happiness, I believe the sense of joy, cities will become livable, urban factors will become more reality, and in that reality, I find the role of an architect is not just make internal small spaces, but keep the overall space in context with the content in head and create an environment that is sustainable beyond today and beyond tomorrow. Can it be done? It's a contradiction or it's a confidence. I leave that to the Forum of Architects to take this, and I thank ARCASIA here for giving me the opportunity to present my little thoughts on my futuristic thinking on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We'll be having the panel discussion, so I request the audience to gather their thoughts and put down all the questions that they'd like to ask to our speakers. And I would now like to request all the speakers to please step up on the stage, and I'd like to hand over the proceedings to our moderator, Architect Sanjeev Vidyarthi.
They set up the table, and while you guys gather your thought, I would request Sanjay Kalra from Somani to run their short little movie while the furniture is set up and the panelists come on stage.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think on behalf of Somani Ceramics, I welcome all of you, whosoever are left in the room. And we thank ARCASIA for providing us this opportunity to share our thoughts with the fraternity. I think we, at Somani, we believe in, always believe, closely working with the architect fraternity for quite some time, and we have been taking inputs, suggestions for continuous product improvement as well as development and bringing in, various kind of products, some few of them which are unique. So I'll just ask them to play a small movie which I think takes you through, complete journey of Somani as well as the products and how we are marketing them. So just, you can play the movie.
At this stage, I want to open it for a little discussion. I think a good idea would be to start with questions. We don't want to keep it too long. And all four of us are available in the evening here in the coffee place and also at the dinner place if you want to have a longer discussion. But I guess it's a good idea to start with a few questions, especially with folks who have been waiting here patiently. So, ma'am, your question.
My question is to you. I was very intrigued with your work that you're doing in China, in Beijing, and especially your what did you call that? The block which just goes in, you know. So I just want to, I really want to know how that happens, because I saw the spaces were very small. And how exactly does it happen? Like you make it somewhere and you bring it there and you just put it in, that's not possible. So you bring it down in, you know, in components, and then you take it there and you just build it up. Now the climate in China is not very pleasant. So what do you do about that? I mean, that was my major concern. Because the moment you just put everything together in the open spaces, you're restricting the flow of air from there. So how does that happen? That was my concern. Yeah.
So you mean the plug-in house, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, actually, no. The system is made of it's prefabricated panels, right? So it's I don't know if you saw in one of the images, but basically yes, it's kind of like you literally sort of like as you bring the panels in. I didn't bring the video, but there is a video that shows you literally how fast it can be made. So the panels can be latched together with one tool. You can basically assemble your entire house with one tool, and they latch together, and you can literally on site cut off, cut off, to the length, or, have it. But essentially, it's just a panelist system that this architecture studio, People's Architecture Office, has invented. So the point is that was thought for these courtyard houses that have one major problem, which is because they're built without fundaments.
Foundation.
They don't have foundation. Sorry. They don't have sanitary facilities, right?
Yes.
So plumbing and all of that. So that system solves that problem. It solves the problem of the shaky, structure that, of course, brings always problems with electricity, with power supply, and etc. And also the insulation issue.
Yes.
So because Beijing actually it's uber hot in summer
extremes.
And gelid in winter.
Yes.
So that system, it's also sort of a control, sort of it's a climatic, kind of little box. So in fact, it is very low cost. It's materially, it's cost effective. It's super low impact for the environment. And it is extremely flexible as a system. So they've also changed, they kind of engineered it 3 years ago. So they started with pilot projects, they tested it, like I showed in the very first slides. And now they literally have perfected it in a sense that you can build literally a house extension with that system. So yeah, it's very ingenious, and it's also not a system that is necessarily just applicable to hutongs, the system is basically just a remedial mechanism that you could use anywhere.
Yeah, I thought so too. And thank you for it. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions?
Just an extension to that. So how does the land thing work? That land belongs to that same house where you're extending it, or it's a different,
No, that depends in the sense that also these kind of operations, of course, are truly experimental, but to a certain extent it also shows how, if taken from the right perspective, even from the level of, policymakers, because you don't do that without the local, authorities to know. You can't do it, right? So there's a round table, and there's very different people around it. There's the local developer, which is a governmental player. There are the residents and the neighbors to the people there. But this is the difference, is that Hutongs are really communities, like they are really strongly resilient, and it's a village. It's a village within the city. People know each other, neighbors, sort of like rely on each other for anything. So, and that kind of, intangible, immaterial value and relationships are extremely valued. So it's also the neighbor, the neighbor become part of that conversation. Of course, nothing is ever, or always perfect, and ideal. But so it's negotiations. It's, like that lengthy process of, but it makes it very simple and in a way effective. In that area where I showed you these 2 houses, they have built another 9, not full houses like that, but they have had the residents that came to them because their studio is in the area. They moved in the area. So residents were going to look for the architects because they wanted to test and understand how they could improve their living conditions. So often, the very first stage of this included the local developer to chip into the cost of the renovation. The resident would put a little bit of money as well to cover at least costs, like for the architects. But this has generated a very infectious, system, contagious system. So that makes change.
Any other questions?
I want to congratulate you.
Thank you.
I loved your presentation, and I think what you said was very, very relevant. And I've been struggling with it all these years, that the inmates of any property keep their property very clean, and they put all the garbage right outside. And the whole place looks dirty, and even, debris from broken buildings and whatever you may say is right there. I have tried at my level how to control that, in where I'm living there.
Wealth from waste.
Something can be done about it, and we are doing something. I think I'm going to take it up from now and see that next time when you're in India, you'll find a change.
Thank you, Rashmi.
Yeah, okay.
I have a question for Ratan. So you showed the little garden under the flyover, right? Under the bridge. And that's the sort of scale, or that's sort of the architectural intervention based on people's cooperation, is what I mean by intermediate level urban design, right? So can you throw a little bit more light on that project, how it came about, how do you think this idea might progress further, and so on and so forth?
The project that I showed you, coincidentally, is not my project. But 15 years ago, when the MSRDC started making all these flyovers, we sort of suggested at least 25 different ways of them using the space under the flyovers, because we realized that that's a vestigial space and nobody's going to be able to handle it. Having said that, I think the important thing is that people are getting much more sensitive to their urban environments. And the pressure from the people, the voice of the people, is sort of being heard, Sanjeev. That makes huge sense. So on the one hand, there are architects who are ready to say, hey, just outside my plot boundary, that's what I should do. And on the other hand, there are communities who are taking this forward. We work with a lot of these communities, and we call them our initiatives. And we have some incredible stuff. So we sort of key the guys on. We have 2-3 communities in Matunga, for example, very crowded. Urban space is useless. It's an open park, so to speak. The BMC doesn't want to have anything to do with it. The slum rehabilitation doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And we sort of egged the community on and said, hey, one morning on a Sunday, we'll come here and we will pretty much move the 25, 30 cars that think that this is their parking lot. And that's exactly what we did. So we tell the cops, we tell the municipal authorities, and we create this community interaction. There's obviously social media, which makes huge sense. So everybody on that group is into the social media story, including the cops, including the MLA, including the politicians. And if a politician wants his glory at that time, yeah, sure, come there and be present, and we'll take photographs with you in there. But effectively, the point is, how do you stop that car from coming back? And these are the issues that we have to have collaboration, so to speak, with the government. All of us are pretty much helpless. All of us have the common objective, but all of us seem to feel that unless we collectively do it, we are helpless, and that is a fact. The point is, if we start these little interventions, I think it goes a huge way. And I've been working with the government for 30 years, and we've realized that you're banging your head against the wall when you're talking about anything. And we realized that the best way to get moving forward is these small interventions. And the small interventions sort of take seed and, create these tidal waves. And you suddenly realize that everybody wants to take over some parking lot, or everybody wants to take over some area under a bridge, or everybody wants to get connected with some social authority or some political authority to see that their footpaths are cleaned or their roads are kept cleaner, etc., etc. So that's a sort of wave that happens from a community.
Thanks for articulating it so well. One final word by Jaisim Saab before we conclude.
Continuing on this point,
Yes.
in Bangalore, although it's tremendously chaotic at the point, whereas where we stay and where I live, two places, the local MP and the local MLA are so cooperative. The entire place is absolutely clean, garbage is zero, it's collected, changed, modified, and it's a pleasure. Because each of us, who are the people who violate our place? The people who come to the opposite park from outside our space. They find our place too clean, so they dirty it. That is, I don't know, either the Indian psyche or it is the human psyche. I have a problem early in the morning. They deliberately park in front of my gate. Although we have very clearly said, no parking here. And the policeman, if he is not from our side, he just pockets something and goes away. But that sensitivity is the human side. Again, we found we create, under the Ideal Homes township thing, isolated about 100 acres, 30 acres, 40 acres places, within which we are able to govern phenomenally. But the moment you cross the barrier, that dirt happens. That is where I find the happening of things. I feel, as you say, it's a lot of sensitivity and larger movement can happen. Is there any specific question from?
No, I guess concluding thoughts. Ratan want to add something to it.
I think it's about no man's land. I think the minute you have a no man's land, there is no ownership. The important thing is somebody has to jump in and take charge. And with that kind of qualitative leadership, I think it works extremely well. So we get the kids in to paint the walls, and we get the residents in to collect garbage and sort stuff out. And then obviously through example, people start listening and hearing and doing things. One very exciting thing was that the municipal authorities, which were taking a back seat, we suddenly realized that they have budgets and they can't use them, and they return those budgets back. And the point is that we are showing them how to use these budgets. And I think that makes huge sense. And every single city and administration and even local community has these kind of budgets and access. So I don't think resources or budgets is a problem. It's just the will. And the will has to be political will, the will has to be bureaucratic will, and the will technically has to be the people's will. And that works, that sells.
Thank you.
I would just like to say, Professor Vidyarthi raised a very valid thought. We don't really think beyond our own boundaries. I mean, as ma'am was saying, somebody puts garbage outside your home, because once you step out of your home, you think it's not my area. You would love it to clean, but you believe that it's not my area. Most of the time, you're out in your offices and you're done. So I really like the small interventions. So I come from Gurgaon. I recently moved in there, and I found it's one of these cities which I have lived in India. The worst land, and probably you find a piece of land and you have to just build something out there. That's all. It's the desert. So, I mean, small interventions like this, now with people living there with high disposable incomes, they just need ideas actually. So, now that you have shown such things, I'm sure if such more ideas can come up, I mean, enough places can turn like that with small interventions and can remain clean.
But the ideas, yeah.
I said we are stuck within that boundary.
Right.
When I get back,
We just have to think.
other is when we start looking.
One important thing is, once you move out, you don't really know if I take lead and do it, whether the government will allow me, whether the municipal corporation will allow me, or tomorrow will they charge me for changing this. So such kind of ideas and all are needed for people, and they need to mobilize and do something about it.
Nobody's going to stop you from doing good stuff, and to clean up, and nobody's going to stop you from doing positive stuff. And if the minute anybody tries and stops you, I think you'll have the whole community behind you saying, hey, we did it. You can't put them all into jail. The second very critical thing is that we should look at ideas which are contextually relevant to India and Indians. We cannot use ideas which have come from somewhere else. And that's the biggest failing of our urban, so to speak, interventions. Yeah? For example, if you're sitting in an Indian context, if you sit in a foreign context, there are benches where you line up, okay? In an Indian context, you sit all facing inwards because the conversation happens there. It doesn't happen against the grain. So small interchanges like this makes a huge difference to how successful or unsuccessful your ideas and interventions are.
A great panel discussion. Thanks. Before I hand over back to Preeti, I want to thank my fellow panelists and the audience for coming out and holding on to the interest and this engagement. For a longish panel, we sort of went over time, but I guess since given that this is the I mean, okay, all right, I take my words back. We finished in a couple hours in our allotted time. All right, thank you everyone.
Thank you so very much. And since our speakers are down here, I think I'll have the felicitations also down here. It kind of, encapsulates our entire afternoon's conversation. And the way it ended with the idea of civic sensibilities, let's stay grounded. I request Architect Geeta Balakrishnan to please step forward and help me honor our sponsors. Mr. Dhar from Somani and Mr. Chaudhary from DSPL. Mr. Dhar. I like he says, Mr. Sanjay is actually, we are giving him a terrible time today. I'm so embarrassed by the fact that we have not shown enough support. But the least we can do is, I think our show of hands can work, Please put your hands together for Mr. Sanjay. He's traveled a long way to come here. I would now like to have Mr. Chaudhary from DSPL here.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mayank here with me.
Please do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Geeta. Thank you, Mayank. Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary. Thank you. Now it's time for us to honor our speakers, our very esteemed speakers, and I invite Architect Rashmi Gupta and Architect Dimple Mittal to do the honors for us, please. Ma'am, if you could please felicitate Architect Jaisim and Architect Batley Boy first. The gentlemen have sent the lady ahead, so we'll have Bia. No. It's amazing. Let's have Bia. Ma'am, please felicitate Bia for us. I now request Architect Dimple to felicitate Architect Batley Boy and Architect Sanjeev Vidyarthi. Right after this photo op. I know you keep giving it back, but this one you're taking home. Architect Sanjeev Vidyarthi. Thank you so much, Dimple. Thank you, our eminent speakers. Thank you all for pleasuring us with your presence. And I have to apologize to our sponsors for whatever glitches have happened that you might have faced. And see you all today evening at the wrap-up session. I hope you had a good time. Bye-bye all. Have fun.